Vienna, 1906. Just as the first snow dusted the leaded roof of Schönbrunn Palace like powdered sugar on a strudel, the imperial library was silent, except for the scratch of a quill and the soft rustle of parchment. Between the high shelves, where the scent of leather bindings mingled with old ink, a woman moved with quiet purpose. She wore the plain navy day dress of a palace servant, her dark hair pinned in a modest coil. Her name was Selia Fairbourne, and though she was born to a seamstress in Philadelphia, she now guarded the emperor's secret texts, scrolls, and codices older than the Habsburg line itself. No one noticed the librarian. That was the point. Until that morning, a tall man in a cavalry officer's uniform stepped into the reading room, snow glittering on his shoulders. His boots echoed on the marble as he approached the central table, eyes scanning the domed ceiling before settling on Celia. "Excuse me," he said. "I was told the imperial maps from the Turkish campaign are kept here." She looked up, startled by his brisk Viennese German, the crispness of his vowels. His face was angular, clean-shaven, and younger than she expected. Late 20s, perhaps. "They are restricted," she replied in careful Austrian dialect. "Only arms ministers or archivists with a signed imperial seal may request them." "My seal." He slid a folded parchment across the table, the wax still unbroken. She noted the eagle crest, the signature His Imperial Highness, Archduke Otto, countersigned by the War Ministry. "You're an archivist?" she asked, skeptical. He smiled, but with weariness more than charm. "Not quite. Lieutenant Lorcan Hawthorne. I'm the Archduke's cartographic aide." Celia lifted the seal gently, broke it, and examined the document. It was genuine. She hesitated, then turned and walked toward the rear chamber. He followed, his boots softer now on the worn carpet. "You're American," he said quietly, not accusing, just curious. "Yes." "Why here?" "Because I read Latin, Ottoman Turkish, and Hungarian. And because the emperor doesn't trust anyone born too close to Budapest." He let out a short breath. "That's fair." She paused at the heavy oak cabinet and opened it with an iron key. Inside lay maps drawn in ink and blood routes cut through Bosnia, troop placements along the Danube, the last desperate lines before the Treaty of Berlin. She laid 3 scrolls on the table. Lorcan leaned in, eyes scanning the Ottoman script. "You can read this?" he asked. "Enough." A beat passed. Then, "Could you help me?" "Why?" "I'm supposed to brief the Archduke by tomorrow. I thought I could manage on my own. But this," he tapped the faded script, "this might as well be Sanskrit." Celia hesitated. She was not permitted to tutor military officers. But the request was quiet, honest. She nodded once. They worked for hours, side by side. She translated in murmurs, and he took notes in a precise hand. Snow thickened outside the arched windows. Once, their fingers brushed as she pointed at a border town, his skin warm, hers gloved. Neither moved. At dusk, she closed the scroll. "That's all for tonight. I have to lock the chamber." He looked up, something unreadable in his expression. "Will you be here tomorrow?" "Yes." He lingered a moment, then nodded and left without another word. The next day, he returned. And the next. Each time, they worked longer. She noticed the way he leaned in to hear her better. The way he stopped calling her Fräulein and began saying Celia, soft and unpracticed. One evening, he arrived soaked from the sleet, coat clinging to his shoulders. She handed him a towel without a word. He took it like a gift. They didn't speak of anything but maps and language. But something grew in the silence between sentences. By the second week, he brought her a leather-bound notebook. "For your translations," he said. "I already have paper. This is better." She opened it. Inside, the pages were blank except the first, where he'd written in careful script, "For Selia Fairbourne, keeper of forgotten truths." She looked up sharply. His face was unreadable. "Thank you," she said. That night, she tucked the notebook under her pillow. But good things in Schönbrunn never stayed untouched. 3 days later, a rustle of skirts followed her into the archive. Baroness von Thalberg, lady-in-waiting to the Empress, stood at the threshold like she owned the air. "The Emperor has summoned Lieutenant Hawthorne to Trieste," she said, examining her gloves. "He departs at dawn." Celia's throat tightened. "Why tell me?" "Because your name was mentioned in his formal request to delay departure." The Baroness's smile was thin. "Don't think your little arrangement has gone unnoticed." Celia said nothing. She didn't flinch. The Baroness stepped closer, voice low. You are a foreigner, unmarried, and without title. He is of the officers' corps. You know the rules. The door clicked shut behind her. Selia stood in the dark, hands trembling. That evening, just after the bells of Vespers, Lorcan appeared at the archive. He was in full uniform, his coat buttoned to the throat. I leave at dawn, he said. So I heard. I asked them to delay. They refused. She nodded, eyes on the scroll she had been copying. I shouldn't have involved you, he added. You didn't involve me. I stayed. He stepped forward. Let me write to you. No. Selia, if you write, they'll monitor it. If I answer, I lose my post. She looked up finally, and he saw the fire under her calm. I won't be the reason they send me back to Philadelphia. He reached into his coat and pulled out something small, a folded note. He placed it beneath her tea tray on the desk. Then don't write back. But read this when I'm gone. She didn't speak. He turned. At the door, he hesitated, then said over his shoulder, There's a duel at dawn tomorrow. Not mine. But I'll be near the field. If you come, I'll know. The door closed behind him. That night, Selia did not sleep. At dawn, she stood beneath the trees near the dueling grounds outside the palace, hidden behind a marble column. Officers gathered around, 2 noblemen pacing off steps, not Lorcan. But he was there, on the edge, his back to her. She stepped forward. He turned. Their eyes met. He crossed the field in seconds, stopping just before her. I didn't think. You said if I came, you'd know. He stared at her, snowflakes melting in his hair. Stay with me. I've never left. He reached for her hand, and this time, she didn't pull away. His fingers closed around hers, warm and certain. Behind them, a pistol cracked. But before the smoke cleared, they were walking away together. The train to Trieste never carried Lorcan Hawthorne that morning. By late afternoon, a discreet letter arrived at the War Ministry bearing the Archduke's seal and a revised directive. Lieutenant Hawthorne was to remain in Vienna indefinitely, assigned to the Ministry of Internal Cartography for imperial security purposes. The wording was precise, the timing impeccable. Selia only learned of it 2 days later, when she discovered Lorcan in the Southern Conservatory, measuring border elevations against old Ottoman topographies. He was bent over a velvet-lined table, cradling a brass compass and using the sunlight to trace altitudes on thin vellum. He looked up when she entered, the expression in his eyes unreadable. You didn't leave, she said. Not yet. He replied, sliding a translucent overlay across the map. The Archduke intervened. She stood still, glancing at the greenhouses beyond the glass. Orange trees bloomed under forced heat, their scent faintly bitter. Why would he do that, she asked. I gave him something he wanted. Or rather, something you translated that no one else could. He straightened, brushing his sleeve. The Ottoman records mentioned a buried passage near the Dalmatian coast. An old sea route. He believes it may hold military value. Selia stepped closer. You let him think I discovered it for him? I didn't correct him. He watched her carefully. I thought you might prefer anonymity. She looked down at the map, silent for a moment, then traced a line with her finger. This passage, if it exists, it's not on any imperial record. It isn't. You're going to find it. Yes. And you want me to help? He didn't answer. Instead, he pulled a folded page from his coat and laid it beside the map. It was a dispatch form and signed. Her name had been typed at the top, next to a ministry seal. They offered you a position, she said. No. I requested it. You're the only one who can read the Ottoman naval ciphers. She met his eyes, the glass between them and the world outside fogging with the heat of the conservatory. If I say yes, I leave the library. You wouldn't be under their thumb anymore. I'd be under yours. He exhaled, slowly. No, you'd be beside me. Selia folded the paper carefully and returned it to him. I need time. That evening, she walked alone through the Hofburg's eastern courtyard, her boots crunching over old frost, the gas lamps flickering overhead. She passed the chapel, where the choir boys rehearsed under lamplight, and turned toward the servants' wing, where she kept a chamber no larger than a pantry. Inside, she lit a taper and opened the leather notebook Lorcan had given her. The pages were still mostly blank. She began writing, not in English or German, but in the old Ottoman calligraphy lines of poetry she remembered from a manuscript long since returned to its locked cabinet. When dawn broke, she was still writing. She arrived at the conservatory before Lorcan. He was surprised to find her already inside, sleeves rolled, sorting through a pile of sea charts. "I'll go," she said simply. He didn't speak at first, only set down his coat and joined her. Together, they worked through the morning, annotating the coordinates, cross-referencing with weather patterns, noting shifts in the Adriatic tides. At midday, a young courier entered carrying a sealed dispatch. Lorcan read it, then passed it to her. The mission was approved. They were to depart in 8 days. That evening, after the last of the guards had passed and the corridors stood still, Selia returned to the library. She moved through the dark with practiced ease, lighting only one lamp. In the deepest drawer beneath the Latin lexicons, she found a wrapped bundle of notes, her earliest translations, the ones that first drew the Archduke's attention. She hesitated, then tucked them under her cloak. As she turned to leave, she found Lorcan waiting by the archway. "You followed me," she said without surprise. "I thought you might want company. I've worked alone for years." "I know." She tilted her head. "Do you always ignore protocol?" "Only when I have cause." "And what's your cause now?" He stepped closer, not touching, but near enough for his breath to reach her cheek. "I want to walk into Trieste with someone who knows how to read the world as it is, not how others say it should be." She didn't answer immediately. Then she reached past him to extinguish the lamp. They stood in the dusk of the stacks, and for the first time, did not need words. When she returned to her chamber, she found a small envelope slipped beneath the door. Inside was a single pressed orange blossom from the conservatory. She placed it between the pages of her notebook. Not as a keepsake, as a promise. The Adriatic air arrived before the sea itself, salted wind curling through the train's corridor, lifting the edge of Celia's collar as she stood by the window. Her fingers, ink-stained and slender, gripped the rail as the coastline slipped into view. Limestone cliffs streaked with lichen, pines clinging to the slopes like stubborn sentinels, and beyond them, the blue-gray shimmer of the harbor. Lorcan, seated behind her, had removed his jacket hours before. His shirt sleeves were rolled to the forearm, and the pulse at his wrist beat visibly as he sorted folded memoranda marked with the Archduke's initials. She turned from the window only when the train began to slow. "I've never seen the sea," she said quietly. He looked up. "You will now." The carriage doors opened onto a station built of pale stone, its arched ceilings painted with flaking frescoes from an earlier century. Trieste pulsed with voices in Friulian, Venetian, and Slavic dialects, the mingling of empires audible in every shouted order and wheelbarrow clatter. They were met not by soldiers, but by a port official, a man with a stiff gait and an accent sharpened by years of naval command. He led them through back alleys rather than boulevards, avoiding the main garrison. Selia noticed the route twisted uphill even as they moved toward the water. They reached a modest villa overlooking the port, its windows shuttered and the courtyard overgrown. Inside, maps had already been pinned across the walls, some with notations in a language she didn't recognize. "These markings," she said, pointing to the margins of one parchment. "They aren't Ottoman." Lorcan stepped beside her, brow furrowed. "Albanian. Coastal dialect." She traced a symbol with her fingertip. "Someone else has been looking for the passage." The villa's back room had been converted into a study. She set her satchel on the desk and began laying out the ciphered naval logs they'd brought. Lorcan watched her in silence for a moment before speaking. "I've never asked what brought you to Vienna, not really." "You never needed to," she replied without looking up. "I want to now." She paused, then closed the logbook. "My father died when I was 17. Consumption. He'd taught languages at the university in Philadelphia. Afterward, I worked in the same library he once did, until a visiting Austrian scholar mistook my notes for his own and submitted them to the Royal Academy. They offered me a position in Vienna. I didn't correct the mistake." Lorcan sat across from her, his expression unreadable. "And your mother?" "She stayed. She had a brother in Boston. I haven't seen her in 9 years." He leaned forward slightly. "Do you regret it?" "No. But I remember her every time I open a letter and hesitate to sign my name." Outside, gulls wheeled over the rooftops, their cries sharp against the hush of the room. Later that evening, after hours spent parsing tide charts and ancient coordinates, Selia stepped into the villa's courtyard. The sky was streaked with violet, the last of the sun melting into the sea. She stood beneath an olive tree, her arms folded against the chill. Lorcan appeared behind her, not announcing himself. They said the passage may have collapsed. A landslide years ago, he said. Then why are we here? Because the Archduke believes it can be cleared. She turned to face him. And you? I think some things are meant to stay hidden. But I also think you wouldn't have come unless you believed there was something worth finding. The silence stretched. Then he stepped closer, not touching, but near enough that she could see how the light dusted the edges of his hair gold. You told me once you stayed because I asked. But you didn't. You stayed because you chose to. She nodded slowly. I've done many things out of necessity. This wasn't one of them. He reached into his coat and held out a folded cloth. She unwrapped it to find a small compass, not brass, but bone-handled, its casing engraved with delicate filigree. It belonged to my grandfather, he said. He mapped the southern coast of Ireland by hand. I thought you should have it now. I can't take this. You already have. She held it in her palm, feeling its weight. They said nothing more. But when they returned inside, she placed the compass beside her notebook, not in it. That night, as they worked by lamplight, their shadows fell side by side across the map of the Dalmatian coast. A faint line had begun to emerge among the layers of translation and tide. A possible inlet, concealed behind a cliff face once marked as impassable. Selia circled it with the ink of Lorcan's pen. Neither of them spoke, but both felt the shift not in the mission, but in something quieter and far more difficult to chart. 3 mornings after Selia circled the inlet on the Dalmatian chart, they stood at the edge of the cove itself, boots pressed into loamy soil above a sheer drop of rock that fell to the sea. The wind here was heavier, laced with the scent of iodine and crushed algae. Far below, waves struck the cliff in dull percussion, steady and indifferent. The inlet was invisible from the waterline. Only when viewed from above, through the fractured lens of old Ottoman triangulations, did its pattern emerge, a narrow break in the rock, camouflaged by layers of shadow and tide. Lorcan crouched beside the ledge, his gloved hand resting on the exposed strata. There's a fault line running beneath it, he said quietly. Any attempt to blast it open would collapse the entire shelf. Selia stepped back from the edge and examined the ridge behind them, where a weathered stone wall crumbled into damp earth. That's why they sealed it from the inland side. Not to protect it, but to trap it. He stood, brushing grit from his hands. They buried it deliberately. She nodded once. Because it held something worth hiding. They camped that night in a ruined watch house a quarter-mile inland. Ivy had overtaken the north-facing wall, and the roof had long since given way to sky. Selia laid her coat over a flat stone and unrolled her scrolls while Lorcan built a fire from driftwood and the splintered frame of an old shutter. The flames smelled faintly of salt and resin. I spent 5 years in the Balkans, Lorcan said without prompting. Mostly border patrol. I watched villages vanish in a single season. Not from war, just exhaustion. No grain. No water. No help. Selia looked up from her notes. And you stayed. I requested it. I thought if I understood the terrain, I could stop it from happening again. He paused. But maps don't show rot. Or silence. Or the way people stop trusting the wind. She didn't answer right away. Then, that's why you recognize the dialect on the map. He gave a slight nod. My interpreter was a girl from Shkodra. She taught me enough to survive. When her father was conscripted, she stayed behind. I never found out what happened to her. The fire snapped. Selia turned back to her notes, but her voice was softer. I used to believe books could hold the whole world. That if I could understand every language, I'd never be lost. And now I know some places aren't meant to be found. Rain came in the early hours before dawn. Not hard, but persistent, threading through the remains of the roof and soaking into the ash. Lorcan rose first, covering the fire with a flat pan to shield the embers. Selia stirred at the sound, pulling her shawl closer as she sat upright. They didn't speak until they reached the rock face again. Selia moved first, tracing the outline of the inlet's inland entry. The stone looked solid, but beneath her touch, she felt the faintest seam, like a hinge long rusted shut. There's a passage here, she said. Not wide, but someone carved it intentionally. Lorcan removed a small hammer from his satchel, the handle worn smooth. We can widen it. Slowly. The work took 3 days. They returned each morning at first light, chipping carefully along the seam, removing no more than a palm's width of stone at a time. Lorcan worked in silence, sweat darkening the back of his collar. Selia steadied the lantern, held the tools, and deciphered the carvings. They uncovered a mixture of Arabic and Greek, the script of sailors and smugglers. On the fourth day, the stone gave way. A narrow corridor opened into darkness, cool and dry, sloping downward. Selia lit a fresh taper, shielding the flame with her hand. The air inside smelled of limestone and something older, old wood, perhaps, or salt bleach parchment. They entered together. The corridor led to a chamber no larger than the palace conservatory. The walls were lined with niches, and within them, sealed amphorae, wooden crates bound in iron, and scroll tubes wrapped in oilskin. Selia stepped forward first, her torch casting long shadows. She selected one scroll and unwrapped it slowly, the fabric still pliant. She read in silence, lips barely moving. Lorcan didn't interrupt. He watched her eyes shift across the page, watched her brow furrow, then smooth. Finally, she looked up. "It's a record," she said. "Not of maps. Of deals. Trade routes. Contraband. Passage permits between Ottoman captains and Habsburg envoys. Names, payments, dates." He stepped closer. "Proof of collusion. Proof of survival," she corrected. "They weren't enemies. Not always. They traded when Vienna refused to send supplies. They built their own system beneath empire." Lorcan exhaled once. "If the Archduke sees this, he'll silence it. Or claim it." She met his gaze fully now. "We can't send it back," she said. "Not like this." He didn't look away. "Then we don't." They worked into the night, cataloging only what they could carry, no more than a rucksack's worth of scrolls and one bound ledger. The rest they resealed, replacing the stones as best they could. That evening, in the watch house, Selia sat beside the fire again, the ledger in her lap. Lorcan handed her a cup of water, then sat beside her without speaking. After a moment, he said, "When we return to Vienna, we'll be watched. I know. They'll separate us if they can. They'll try." He looked at her then. Not sharply, not with urgency, but with a steadiness that settled into her ribs like warmth after cold. "I won't let them," he said. She didn't answer. She only reached for his hand, and this time, their fingers wove together without hesitation.